I'm shorter. That's a little bit of a tough act to follow. So as our lovely chair mentioned, I am, full disclosure at this point, still a member of the New Democratic Party. I am a member of my federal riding association executive, as I have a lot of respect for my MP, and the other members of my riding association. That said, we continue to have a lot of really difficult discussions at our riding association. And I can assure you that not a single member of my executive campaigned for Mulcair in his leadership campaign. And I'm also a recent member of IS, and I will touch upon that a little bit later as to how that sort of came about. I grew up in a family, just because I don't know a lot of you, and you might not know who I am. I grew up in a family of trade unionists, feminists, and activists. One of my moms, Sue, let me cast her vote from a very, very young age. She would bring me into the voting booth and hand over the pencil, and it was her opinion that enough education had happened to me and I could make that decision. So I remember that most times I cast a vote for the NDP, except for when very close friends were candidates for the Communist Party. One such example was a dear friend of the family, the late Marvin Glass, who we lost just a week or so ago. Marvin, who I will miss dearly, was instrumental in building a solidarity network with Cuba, and I was incredibly lucky to have the opportunity to meet with Cuban delegates almost every summer at our cottage, discussing international movements of solidarity, politics and social movements, and what was possible here in Canada. I am not here necessarily to provide answers or a clear direction moving forward, because I myself continue to be conflicted and unsure about next steps. I would just like to discuss some of the ways that I think that the NDP has changed recently, and some of the examples of the party's responses to social movements in recent days, to sort of build on the insights that Nora has just given us, and some of the questions she's posed about the capacity of this party, and whether it is possible from inside or outside to shift it far enough in the left, or for it to stand for what we think it originally stood for. I have many friends who have worked or still work for the federal party. They are part of the machine in Ottawa. And in the past 2 years, after the unprecedented victory and expansion of the party in 2011, things have changed a lot. Many of my friends have chosen to leave their positions, or some are just unsure of where their next step will be. From an organizational standpoint, it's easy to imagine how this happened. Suddenly, hundreds of new staff needed to be hired. People who applied for these positions weren't necessarily staunch party loyalists or even socialists, but often people who saw the NDP as the new Liberal Party or the new party moving to power. In this period of time, we also lost our leader. That meant that for the next year or so, while the party was undergoing a leadership campaign, don't get me started on the lackluster list of candidates, the party was restructuring, being organized from within, and it became a much more bureaucratic, top-down organization than it had ever been before. Not that the atmosphere on the Hill was ever perfect, but my friends say that it has become a climate of machismo, male dominance, and a broad culture of ego and power. And so when this happens, what gets left behind? What gets forgotten? What is no longer a priority in this climate within the party? Social justice, feminism, having a feminist voice at all. It moved into becoming an insular top-down structure. At the federal level, the current reality is that we basically have two liberal parties. This is not only devastating to leftist movements, who have pushed for a progressive party to be at the forefront, who grew the party to be what it was, but it also significantly increases the power of this united right conservative regime. So I guess the questions that we're here to ask or to discuss are, how do we move forward, and what is the evidence about the party, both federal and provincial, current responses to movements at each level? The question is it in building grassroots movements outside the party that have become too large to ignore that we can impose change? What has happened in recent years or months when our party has been handed social movements to them on a silver platter. And sort of two examples that stick out to me. One is the huge mobilization of childcare advocates in BC. They mobilized a hugely successful campaign that resulted in having both the Liberals and NDP in BC have to change their policy at the times because they had to respond to this outpouring of support for a broad-reaching policy option. They put the parties also into a position where they were immediately coming up short because they provided a full new idea, a rethinking of how childcare worked in BC. And all the parties could really do was say, okay, well, we'll give you this piece of it, or we'll give you a small part of it. And it was really handing policy to the NDP on a silver platter, in my opinion. And yet we can see when the campaign was successful, achieving thousands of endorsements and broad public appeal, the NDP was still resistant to take it on. They upped their commitment to reduce fees, but they maintained that such a radical shift would have to be a second-term type idea, or that it was just not possible in the current economic climate. With thousands of people saying this was what they wanted, hitting the news every single day, they weren't willing to take a step forward. The second is Idle No More and Chief Theresa Spence hunger strike, which for me was a huge turning point in my support for the NDP. While I in no way felt that we were perfect on relations with our First Nations, I was stunned by the complete lack of action and in the end hurtful action that the party's leadership chose to take. Even looking at things from a perspective of cynicism and political strategy, it made absolutely no sense to me. Chief Spence was taking a hugely brave and personal stand against Harper's regime. This set the stage for a much broader movement challenging our colonial past, our destruction of the environment, and complete failure to provide a decent standard of living for all. Similar to the aforementioned BC Child Care campaign, this was a gift for the NDP. At least 20 of the members of the caucus, some of them whom I continue to hold in high regard, were outspoken about their support for Spence and the growing movement, and visited her during her hunger strike. And yet that wasn't the party's position, or that of the leader. I nearly fell off my chair when I heard that Thomas Mulcair announced, following in Harper's footsteps, that he urged Spence to end her hunger strike.
Shame.
I read countless of amazing responses from sisters across the country about how this paternalistic act undermined the deeply personal practice of fasting in Indigenous traditions. For the record, it was very shortly after this that I joined the IS. And so, just to put that into real perspective, Justin Trudeau, chose to visit her. I don't claim to be a genius in political strategy, but if Justin Trudeau is making better political decisions than you, or appearing more progressive, you're doing it wrong. And with that, I would like to hand it over to Rich, and then we'll take questions.
Thanks, both Nora and Katie. I think this is a really important discussion because it was only last year's Marson event we were all sort of taking a step back and reeling from the orange wave that had sort of rolled across the country and trying to analyze what this means, because obviously it was an outgrowth, I would argue, of the mood that Occupy sort of represented, a mood of anger at the economic crisis, the deterioration of working people's lives, that all of these things, that people were hungry for some form of alternative, and the democracy, so-called democracy that we live in, parliamentary elections come to play a role of allowing people at least one little moment, 15 seconds in a little booth, to express their opinion about how things should happen. And I think that was my analysis, and I think many other people on the left's analysis of why there was an orange wave. Obviously, Thomas Mulcair had a very different opinion of the orange wave, which was, just assuming this is what he thinks, is that if only the party had moved further to the right in that election, they might have just actually beaten Harper. And so it's strange to be in less than a year or a year and a half that had such a moment of excitement already now be crashing down in a wave of demoralization. When your party is the opposition, which in parliamentary sort of politics allows you to just say whatever you like, attack the party in power, and it's Stephen Harper with buddies like Mike Duffy and Rob Ford running the show. This is not a hard government to be taking on. And yet the only moment of excitement was when Mulcair apparently gave, Stephen Harper a good tongue lashing the other day in Parliament. I watched it. It was a rather perfunctory, boring little thing, and nothing at all that I would have suspected one would be able to do. But nonetheless, that is where I think things are. And so we have to ask ourselves, what has happened? Is this new? And I would argue it's not new. If we look at what just happened in BC, where, the NDP beautifully snatched defeat from the jaws of victory by allowing the Liberals to walk in because they had no platform that would address the crisis inside people's lives right now and the crisis in the society we live in. They would say the Liberals were bad, but they wouldn't say, as someone pointed out, we're going to cancel the pipelines and instead embark on a massive retrofit by employing thousands of plumbers and pipe fitters and training people, and we're going to do all of these and create jobs and be damned to the market. We're going to actually try to transform people's lives. Instead, it was the Liberals have done a lot of bad things, and well, we're not really going to change any of that. That was the NDP's campaign, and if the party that's supposed to be an ally of the poor and working people basically says we won't reverse, we don't even have the courage to reverse the attacks that the Liberals have engaged in, well then maybe the Liberals were right. Maybe workers and the poor are the problem. That's a conclusion I think a lot of people might be able to draw. If we look at Ontario, where the NDP had a sparkling moment, a very simple, mild little proposal. How about we have a tax on the incredibly wealthy? Overnight, Andrea Horwath became the most popular politician in Ontario. They haven't said hardly anything about that since. Instead of recognizing that there was a deep mood of class anger at the 1%, at the filthy rich who profit off of everything we do. In Ontario, there was a real mood depth of anger. What did the NDP do? They made a deal with the Liberals, they got a little tax implemented, and then they walked away from any discussion of class struggle, and in the process, actually tried to jettison most of the unions at the same time. If we look at Nova Scotia, where the NDP's been in power, and there's people from Nova Scotia here, simple little things like maybe changing the Labor Relations Act, made it a little easier. Jody, couldn't do it. Couldn't do it. Couldn't even replace Tory appointees at the Labor Board. Okay, every government comes in, you get rid of the old party's bureaucrats. No, couldn't do that. That would be unfair, they said. Attack schools, attack teachers, attack education. They made some great gains in healthcare, but if you read it carefully on all the promotions on this, doing well with the money that they've allotted to healthcare. Nova Scotia healthcare is ranked #1. Doing well with the money they've allotted, not that there was a massive infusion of new money, so on and so forth. Now people on the left in Nova Scotia have to face a real debate about what do you do in the upcoming election and what does that mean. And I think that this is a debate that's going to be going on all over the place, because what does it mean? And if we look at what just happened at the recent convention of the NDP, the ditching of socialism, you think what a distance from the days of the Regina Manifesto, when the NDP would compete with the Communist Party to get busloads of people out to support strikers at, in Oshawa, Fords in Oakville, Fords in Windsor. When that was the mood of the party, the mood wasn't by the leadership to run from strikes and run from struggle and hide from teachers demonstrating. It was to actually go and to try to build. We had a manifesto that said it is about working people capturing the wealth that they create and building an equitable society, basically by overthrowing capitalism. I disagree with the method they chose to do that. I think you can see the result of that method, which is a parliamentary method. And so the question is this new? The betrayals in Nova Scotia, the debacles in Ontario at the federal level, in BC, is this new? Is this something fundamentally different? Is it really a shift from Mulcair, from orange wave to third wave? Or is it just third wave back to the third way again? And I would argue that that's what it is. That there isn't a big shift under Mulcair. I think you can feel that way as an NDP activist, but I think when you take a step back and look at the practice of the NDP in power, and it's not just the NDP, I'm not saying this to harp on about that, but all social democratic parties around the world have fallen into the same trap. And this trap is to see Parliament as the location of change. And so Parliament, or whatever, what's it called, Ontario? Queen's Park, there we go, sorry. It's important, but I obviously don't pay enough attention to it. If change comes through Parliament, and change comes through, every 4 years, people going to polls and electing, then the goal has to be to win that election. If you can transform capitalism by passing an act, by saying, tomorrow there shall be no capitalism, then obviously the goal of every socialist should be to win an election, to get as many seats as you can, because we will be able to stand up one day and say, by ruling order number 32, the new Parliament in Canada says bosses are abolished. Hooray, we're done, everybody can go. Unfortunately, capitalism doesn't operate that way, and neither does Parliament. Parliament is an institution of the ruling class. It was created to justify class rule, and while we have to defend our democratic rights to vote, as many people did when we fought against the prorogation of Parliament, it is not an institution of changing capitalism or getting rid of it. And I think that that's something we have to come to terms with. That if you see Parliament as a place of change, and the object is, don't worry about your principles, just get seats, right? And that is what the NDP has generally done over the last while. So, its object is to tame capitalism, not get rid of it. That is what I would argue about the NDP. That it claims to be arguing that we have to do what is real, and be realistic. That seems to be the new line. So my question, is it realistic, as someone pointed out, for people in Sarnia and the First Nations to die of cancer? Is it realistic that First Nations in BC have to watch their land get ripped up for pipelines to be built? Is it realistic that we can't have decent health care in Canada? Is it realistic that there has to be welfare cuts? This is what, when people say we have to be realistic, they're talking about. They're saying we have to be realistic by allowing Stephen Harper to savage a cut and enrich the 1%. Well, the 99% just has to sit tight and wait until the next election. Because remember, when we get enough seats, that's when we'll really change things. And I know we didn't do it in Ontario with Bob Ray, and I know we didn't do it in BC under Glenn Clark and the others, and I know we haven't done it in Nova Scotia, but this time we really will. That is the constant mantra. And it's not that people in the NDP don't want that change. And this is what I would argue. Because I could go for like an hour. Pardon? 10 minutes? Oh, good. I'm doing it a lot. Slowly. So the question is, what does that mean for the left? And I think that there's different responses to this. One is to say, be damned to the NDP. We don't care about them. Let's just, ignore the NDP and denounce everybody who's got anything to do with the NDP as being a capitalist or one of the enemies. The other strategy, I think, is to say we have to recapture the NDP to some glorious moment that existed, and I would support that if it was about the NDP retaking over the Regina Manifesto with some tweaks. But those are the two sort of strategies that sort of get put forward. And for the first one, the one that says we may just ignore the NDP, don't worry about it, we'll just find a better way, I would say that misunderstands why people look to the NDP. Because the NDP isn't an insignificant thing. It's a big political party. Many of us, if you go to a demonstration, go to a picket line, people might no longer be carrying NDP banners, but I can guarantee you lots of those people, if they don't have NDP membership cards in their pocket right now, come an election, they're out actually trying to win, trying to help a candidate. And every activist that's built a movement knows that. The minute an election's called, there tends to be a giant, albeit it's not as big as it used to be, but a giant sucking sound on activists leaving the movements to go and campaign for somebody in the NDP. So it's obvious. So why do people look to the NDP? It's not just because it's become the third way or ditched socialism. The NDP hasn't changed its nature fundamentally. It still represents, I would argue, for thousands and thousands and thousands of activists and people who want to fight and want to see change. It represents their aspirations for a better world. And because of that, we have to take everybody who has aspirations for a better world seriously and engage with them and talk to them. Secondly, the NDP represents, albeit I would argue in a deformed way, the recognition by thousands of working people and activists the necessity for our own independent political organization. Although this organization, as the NDP is constituted, is oriented on Parliament, it is a basic recognition that the Liberals and the Tories are bosses' parties. Okay, they are parties to represent the ruling class, and the 99% needs its own political expression in parliamentary politics and in politics as a whole. And for that, I think it's an incredibly important thing. Because look at the problems that happen in the United States, right? For all my attacks on social democratic parties, it represents an advance in working people's understanding that we need our own political party. I might disagree with the orientation of that party in Parliament, but it is a recognition of that, and it's an important recognition, I think. Which means that I would still go vote for the NDP, regardless of everything I've said and continue to say about the NDP, but I don't vote for it because of its platform. Good God, of course not. I vote for it to be side by side thousands of working people, poor people, activists who are desperate for some sort of change, any sort of change, and most of them now walk to the polls with some sort of knowledge they will be betrayed and let down by the NDP. But also, if and when the NDP wins, after that orange wave swept through Quebec, lots of people went into work and looked at their boss who had, Conservative Party buttons or Liberal Party. It was a little smile, we're coming to get you next, right? And that confidence that it can give momentarily is also another important reason why I would still vote for the NDP, because it represents those aspirations and that sort of hope. However, the problem still is, what do we do? Do we be be in the NDP? Do we be out of the NDP? What do we do? To me, it's a tactical question. But right now, my argument would be is that to spend your time inside the NDP arguing for resolution Y or resolution X is a bit of a mug's game. The party policy book is quite wonderful. If you read through it, there's all kinds of great policies, policies against pipelines, policies for disarmament, policies for conversion, policies for all kinds of things. But the way the party is structured, because it's a parliamentary party, who runs the party? The people that have seats in Parliament run the party, not the membership. The membership they can pass all the resolutions they like, but there is no real democracy inside the NDP. So to me, to try to push for change internally is not the place where energy should be spent. If we look at some of the great things the NDP has done recently, it was one of the only social democratic parties in the world that came out against the war on Iraq, if you think about that. No other social democratic party in the world did that, which I think is something that they should be lauded for. But the question is, how did that come about? Did that come about just because people passed resolutions, or did it come about because there was a mass movement built on the streets that was not built at the start by the NDP? It was built by activists in the NDP, but it was built on the streets, outside in the communities, in the neighborhoods, in the workplaces, and that movement forced the NDP to the left momentarily, right? And so to me, the question becomes, where is it best to spend our time? Now, I'll go vote. It's 2 minutes of my life, pretty much over the whole span of my life. But I think we should spend our time trying to find a way to recreate and rebuild a political alternative for working people to look to that isn't based on winning seats in Parliament, but sees parliamentary elections as a tool to amplify voices about building movements on the shop floor and in the streets. And to me, that's the most important difference between something like Quebec Solidaire and the NDP, is that from everything I've read about Quebec Solidaire, its parliamentary deputies don't just see themselves as playing little games and, parliamentary, whatever chicanery and these, whatever they do there, all these silly games and stuff like that. They see themselves as amplifying and trying to put forward alternatives for people outside of Parliament, not trying to convince the politician across the floor, but actually trying to amplify the voice of the streets inside Parliament and use that profile to actually try to build movements. And to me, that's an important difference. And so the question becomes, how do we build that? And that's a question I think a lot of us are going to be discussing. But in the meantime, I will say this, one of the things I think everybody on the left has to really think about is, I would argue, and Katie, you were alluding to this, is that there is a decomposition at the base of the NDP right now, where there are more labor activists that I know that are wandering around demoralized and homeless and trying to figure out, what is it that I do next? The class isn't resisting as much as it should be in terms of inside the unions, but the NDP has walked away from thousands of activists and riding associations and other places through the mechanisms that, and things that Katie has outlined. So the question is, how do we relate to those people, and how do we give them hope, and what kind of alternative do we provide for them? And to me, the International Socialists is a very small sliver of an attempt to actually do that, and that's why I'm a member of the International Socialists, because I think it looks the same. We want to be side by side everybody in the NDP, where we're fighting for justice, but we're arguing we don't think that that change will come through Parliament. We believe that, as Karl Marx said, the emancipation of the working class has to be the act of the working class itself, not its parliamentary deputies. And that's why we need a revolutionary organization to continually push on that and say that there is a possibility for change. Occupy, I don't know more. These things are fantastic examples that change isn't going to come from Parliament, but change is going to come from us, and that's what we in the International Socialists stand for. And that's where I think, if you got a choice between being in the NDP or being a revolutionary socialist, I'd say park yourself with the revolutionary socialists.